Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. And by No Foods. No grain, no gluten, no guilt.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, we think about food a lot, right? With diabetes, you have to. But sometimes all of those decisions and pressure and that feeling that you've lost control can turn into a real problem. This week, a tough subject, an eating disorder, what many people call diabulimia.
I was an emotional eater. I used food when I was bored. I used food when I was sad. I used food when I was happy. And then I had this diabetes aspect where I was also then taught to be obsessive about food and obsessive around numbers. And by the time I was 14, those two factors had just swirled together to create a very vicious eating disorder.
My guest is Erin Akers. She's found her way back from that vicious disorder, and now she's trying to help others do the same. Plus, a look at the rise of type 1 in China in adults, a new study that's puzzling researchers. And it turns out leading a service can be just as stressful as playing a full game of football. Hey, remember, this podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. It all starts now on Diabetes Connections. Welcome to another week of the show. Really glad you're here. This is an important interview we have today. And I want to say up front, don't be scared. This is not doom and gloom. I have to admit that when I booked this guest and knew we were talking about an eating disorder related to diabetes, I was a little nervous about how it would go. But not only is there very valuable information here, Erin is an amazing advocate. She's great to talk to. I think you'll enjoy this interview, if I can even say that. We're talking about such a tough subject, but really stay with it. She's terrific. Anyway, if you are new to Diabetes Connections, we aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection. My son was diagnosed 11 years ago. My husband has type 2. I don't, but I have a background in broadcasting, and that's how you get the podcast. So if you are in our Facebook group, and I really hope you are, it's Diabetes Connections, the group, you saw pictures of my son's Bar Mitzvah. And I really hope you'll come to the Facebook group. It is Diabetes Connections, the group. And I'm going to talk about that later on in the show, about the Bar Mitzvah and a little bit more about it. But I just wanted to share this first. I don't know why I was surprised, but I was in that Friday night. He helped lead part of the regular Shabbat service. And of course, Saturday morning is the longer service during which time the actual Bar Mitzvah happens, so to speak. But Friday night, Benny's blood sugar, after he led a few prayers and got up in front of the whole congregation, it shot way up. And it didn't occur to me, I kind of figured, okay, that's an adrenaline high, but it didn't occur to me to treat it like we do in sports. What we often will do is kind of ignore it, just bolus for food, keep an eye on it, and it just naturally comes down later. And so like an idiot, I don't know what I was thinking, I guess I was just so distracted. We said, oh yeah, we'll bolus this way. And of course, he was low all night. I felt so bad. We haven't had like a 2 juice box night in a long time. I think this was a 3 one. It was just crazy. But he rallied the next day and did a great job. And we were much more careful Saturday night. Even so, with all the dancing at the party and the celebration, we did have another bunch of lows, but not as bad as Friday night. But live and learn, I guess. There's no next time on this Bar Mitzvah, but it was wild to see how the stress of public speaking can really mimic the stress that we see in sports. Diabetes Connections, is brought to you in part by Dexcom. And one of the best features of the Dexcom G5 Mobile are the customizable alerts and alarms. Customizable threshold alerts provide advance warning of hypo and hyperglycemic events before they happen. Alerts help Benny when he is distracted during times like playing or being a normal teenager, or of course when he's sleeping. And we have found it incredibly helpful to troubleshoot high blood sugars before they get too high and to catch lows before they get too low. When Benny's hanging out with friends or playing sports, I love that the Dexcom will alert him if he needs to take action. And overnights, Talk about peace of mind. I mean, I cannot imagine using a continuous glucose monitoring system without alarms. It just wouldn't work for us. Find out more about the Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Well, let's talk about diabulimia for a minute here. If you've never heard about it, diabulimia is an eating disorder where a person purposefully manipulates or withholds insulin in order to lose weight. Research suggests that over 30% of diabetic women between the ages of 15 and 30 engage in insulin omission to some degree, and type 1 diabetics are 2.5 times more likely to develop an eating disorder than other women. Diabulimia can happen to men as well. And my guest this week is shining a light on this troubling issue. She knows what she's talking about. I will let her tell her story. It's a firsthand story here. But Erin Akers has dealt with her own diabulimia. It led her to start a helpline. In fact, it is the world's first nonprofit organization dedicated to education, support, and advocacy for diabetics with eating disorders and their loved ones. Here's my talk with Erin Akers. Erin, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk about what seems like it'll be a difficult subject to talk about.
Yeah, diabulimia definitely, and eating disorders in general is it's my bread and butter, but it's definitely something that hits close to home for me, obviously, as I suffered, and something that is definitely a tender subject for a lot of people. So I'm happy to come on and get to talk about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Can you just start by explaining what diabulimia is?
Yeah, so diabulimia is not a medical term. It's a media coined term, which means diabetics who purposefully withhold their insulin in order to lose weight. It was kind of just a portmanteau word where they threw together diabetes and bulimia and got diabulimia. But it stuck, and we really cling to it because we think if you can identify your demon, then it is the first step in being able to defeat him. And it was also a way to build a community in which there was none. There was no one talking about this disease. There was no real community online for it. And so as soon as we found a word to really describe the disease, we really took to it.
Is there a clinical term or something for what we're talking about?
There isn't actually. The closest that has been come is ED-DMT1, which means eating disorder, diabetes mellitus type 1, which definitely does not roll off the tongue. And it applies to all eating disorders within the confines of a type 1 diabetic. So just any eating disorder, including diabulimia and type 1 diabetes mellitus. So it is a broader term that can cover more. But it definitely, and it also is not a medical term either. It's just a term that a bunch of doctors came together at a conference and said, well, we like this term more. This applies to more people. And so there really isn't a medical term, a medical diagnostic code for what a lot of people, a lot of diabetics go through.
It's interesting because from the little I've read about it, it seems as though up to a third of women with diabetes go through something like this.
That's right. 35 to 40% of type 1 diabetics will, at some point in their life, especially women, will try to omit their insulin in order to lose weight, or will experiment with some other form of disordered eating or an eating disorder. And a lot of the newer research coming out is showing that that applies to men as well, and that up to 15% of type 1 diabetic men are also engaging in diabulimia or other eating disorder behavior. And what we're seeing is that across the board, type 1 diabetics are falling through the cracks of this eating disorder behavior because it's so every day in the diabetic world where you are so rigid in your eating behaviors, and it is so obsessive. It's so normal to be obsessive about numbers and about food. And so that line between normal and diabetes and obsessive about food is so blurred. And so it happens every day to up to 35% of type 1 diabetics.
Wow. So what's your story? You've been very open about sharing your experience with eating disorders. Were you a teenager? Tell us what happened if you could.
Yeah, so I was 10 when I was diagnosed, well, just under 10. I was 9 technically when I was diagnosed with diabetes. And I had very disordered eating almost from the very get-go. And I was 14 when I decided to, not decided, but kind of fell into diabulimia and started really, really omitting insulin, very much hardcore. And at the time, I didn't even know it was an eating disorder. I thought it was completely a behavior I had made up. I thought I had created this eating disorder. At the beginning, it was just diabetes burnout. I was tired of being a diabetic. I was tired of being different from my friends. And I was just tired of diabetes. And so I did what a lot of diabetics do, and I quit testing my sugar as much, and I quit taking my insulin as much. And then I noticed the weight drop off. And I put two and two together, and my eating disorder was kind of born. And what they say is that there are all different sorts of factors surrounding eating disorders, and it's a perfect storm to kind of create that eating disorder. And for me, it was I didn't have healthy thought patterns around food. I was using food as an emotional I was an emotional eater. I used food when I was bored. I used food when I was sad. I used food when I was happy. And then I had this diabetes aspect where I was also then taught to be obsessive about food and obsessive around numbers. And by the time I was 14, those two factors had just swirled together to create a very vicious eating disorder. And it turned very deadly for me very quickly. I was already in the hospital with my first DKA admission within a few months. And by the time I graduated high school, I had had over a dozen hospital DKA admissions, and I actually ended up missing my own prom because I was in the hospital for DKA. Because at that time, the eating disorder had become so important, not so important, but so in control that I had really lost my own hold on what I thought. At one point, I had used as a control to try to take back what I thought I had lost control of in my own body and lost control again. And so by the time I was 17, I had a very full-blown eating disorder that was very much in control of my life. And I also had developed neuropathy because I'd been practicing this behavior for almost 4 years. And so I had very out-of-control diabetes for almost 4 years and developed my first complication. And all the doctors at the time said, oh, it can't be neuropathy. She's too young. And it turns out it was neuropathy. And it was kind of the beginning of my jaunt into recovery was that first wake-up call. But it would be a couple years more before I had a very firm grasp on recovery. And it would take a lot of close calls. It would take getting gastroparesis and then a lot more hospital visits, and then eventually a very severe surgery to fix a shattered leg. And then I died after surgery. Gosh. I did. I flatlined in the hospital. I quit breathing, and my heart, they couldn't find a heartbeat, and they had to resuscitate me because my body was so weak and had no potassium and no sodium and just no electrolytes because I'd been omitting my insulin and messing with my blood sugar for so long, and my body had nothing left to give at that point. And so when I came back, I saw my mom standing in the corner of the room and, tears streaming down her face, and the look on her face, she'd just seen her baby girl die. And I knew I never wanted that pain again. I never wanted to be the source of that pain on my mother's face. And that I really had just lost all semblance of control of my life. And that's kind of when I really turned things around. And at the time when I came out and started really looking for help, I turned to a lot of diabetes organizations, and they said, well, this is an eating disorder problem. Go talk to the eating disorder organization. So I went and I talked to them, and they said, well, this is a diabetes problem. Go talk to them. And I looked at the studies, and my aunt, who's also a type 1 diabetic, had suffered from this herself. And I knew that this was a big problem, but nobody was doing anything about it, which is how the helpline was formed. There were no nonprofits devoted to it, and none of the nonprofits that existed were doing anything about it. And so we formed in 2009 and incorporated in 2010 as the first nonprofit devoted exclusively to diabetes and eating disorders. Because if there was any other cohort of the population where 35% were getting sick and dying of eating disorders, you would be hearing about it. But because we are 10% of the diabetics are type 1, and then 35% of that population, we end up in this very niche little pocket, but it ends up being hundreds of thousands of us that suffer from this problem and that end up dying every year. Young girls and men in their 20s that we lose every year.
Erin, I'm just, it is so emotional to hear your story for so many reasons. I mean, as a woman who has kind of struggled with weight, I don't have type 1, I'm listening and thinking, if I were in your shoes, what would I have done, as a teenager with all that pressure to lose weight? As a mom of a kid with type 1 who's on the heavier side, I don't even know if he knows this. I don't know. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I definitely have to talk to him about. But the strength that you and your family have shown to not only kind of get yourself, I'm not even sure of the right language to use, to move on from such a dire situation and to help others. How did you get from being in that hospital room to where you are now? We'll get right back to Erin in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. And for 7 years, One Touch Vario test strips have delivered reliable results you can trust. And did you know they have the lowest copay on the most health plans? And they're always covered on traditional Medicare Part B. To upgrade today to the One Touch Vario Flex meter, visit diabetes-connections.com and click on the One Touch logo. Coverage and payment may be subject to co-insurance, deductible, and patient eligibility requirements. LifeScan does not guarantee coverage or payment. Now back to my interview with Erin Akers.
It was not. I will give so many thousands of thanks to my therapist, Lisa. And I'm a big believer in ACT therapy and really finding your values and working towards them. And at the end of the day, when I looked into my core values, being thin wasn't one of them. And my values included my education and which I'd had to put on hold, and my family and the possibility of, my career one day. And none of those things were being accomplished by setting my sights on the smallest possible pant size. And I'd had to drop out of college because of how sick I had gotten. And I was taking, semesters off, and I had to keep dropping courses, and my academic career was really taking a hit from it. And my relationship with my family was very strained from it. And my friendships were starting to become strained from it. And I looked at all of these values that I knew I wanted to embody one day, and I wasn't embodying any of them. And I'm very lucky in that one of our volunteers, patients, ended up moving from Indiana out here to Seattle to come and work with us. And she ended up becoming my best friend and my adopted sister. And she has one of the most beautiful recovery stories. And she got pregnant, and her daughter is now my niece and my goddaughter. And I often ask myself in times of hardship, what would I want to embody for her? And it's never a certain pant size. When she grows up, I never think, I'm going to want to make sure I'm pant size X for Lily to look up to. It's always things about courage and strength and intelligence and honesty. And those were not things that I was keeping up in my day-to-day life, embracing my eating disorder. I was basically doing all the things that went against my core values to live my eating disordered life. And so it was a lot of hard work with a therapist, and I went into an eating disorder treatment center for an inpatient for 90 days that did not at the time have a diabulimia specific program. Thankfully, since then, Diabulimia Helpline has done a lot of work with treatment centers to actually put in place diabetes specific treatment protocols. At the time, there were none, so we were kind of hodgepodging our way through a treatment protocol for diabetic, but we did it, and it was kind of throwing everything under the kitchen sink at this problem, because if we didn't, I knew I wasn't going to come out on the other end. I basically tried everything I could to keep my eating disorder, and what it had gotten me was literally dying. And so I thought, let's try the other side. Let's try throwing everything I could at recovery, because I knew what the eating disorder had gotten me, and I knew what that path looked like. And I had to try a different path, and I had to try something new. And I knew that for me, that meant not isolating And so that's how the Facebook group got started. I knew there were other diabetics like me out there, and that's what grew into the helpline. And that was 9 years ago. And next year we get to celebrate a decade of the Facebook support group, of people making connections and friendships. And so many of our members have come back and posted, I found the support here I needed to recover, and now I have a baby, and I got married, and I graduated with my degree. And those are the moments that get me through in the dark times, are knowing that we were the rock and the support that someone needed to make those first steps.
So if someone listening knows a friend, an adult with type 1, or has a teen child, or just who has possibly showing some of these signs that there's diabulimia going on, what can we do? Not the person who has it, but what can we do to help them?
I think that's such a great question. If someone is suffering, I think one of the best things to know is that Diabulimia Helpline has a 24-hour hotline. So we have a phone number that it's 425-985-3635 that you can call at any time. And it's 24 hours a day, staffed by volunteers who have all been trained on diabulimia, on crisis protocols, so that you can give that number out, or you can call yourself. And as a family member, we are trained on how to talk to your teen about diabulimia, because pretending like they're not going to hear about it is no longer an option. We're hearing stories that I learned about this at diabetes camp. I learned about this, on the internet, looking for diabetes weight loss tips. This information is out there. And so for parents, you are going to need to talk to your kid about this. It's becoming just as well known in the diabetes community as something like anorexia or bulimia is in the general community.
Well, and that was my next question. I'm sorry to cut you off, but that was my next question is, I don't want to talk to my son about this because he's not showing any of the signs of it.
Exactly.
But I have to.
And we hear that a lot, is that where's the difference between awareness and straight up giving them the idea. But the unfortunate truth is because so many of our clients and so many of our group members say things like, I heard about it at diabetes camp, or I learned about it in a diabetes chat room. The information is very much out there, and it is very much being shared with teenagers, especially, as a secret, oh, you need to lose some weight. Well, here's a trick I learned. And so one of the things we've actually started putting together for 2018 is our leadership training for diabetes camps, for those counselors, for what they need to do if they hear those conversations going on in their cabins, because it's becoming such a widely spread, talked about topic at diabetes camps. But it is something that parents are going to have to start addressing the same way a parent would have to address anorexia or bulimia, because the information is out there. And I would say that it's time that we have to start being honest with our teenagers about eating disorders. And this is just, unfortunately now, just another one that they're going to learn about, which is that as much as this is very alluring for today, the long-term side effects of it are not going to line up with your long-term goals. And I would say make sure you don't start lecturing about consequences and the side effects that we've been hearing about every day for every appointment since we got diagnosed with diabetes. We always say, I've heard that talk, I don't need to hear it again. And what so many diabetics want to talk about are the mental aspects of it and the emotional aspects of it. And so what we say to doctors when we do our doctor education program is don't ask them how their sugars have been, and don't ask them how their A1C has been, but ask them how they have been with diabetes. Like, hey, how has your diabetes struggle been? How has it been living with diabetes? How has it just been being you with diabetes? Because those are the questions, those open-ended questions that can start to get to where you can hear the answers that you're looking for. Like, oh, she's dealing with some depression with her diabetes, or there's a lot of diabetes distress there that I wasn't aware of. And when you can pick up on things like that, that's the first step in being able to pick up on an eating disorder before it becomes a full-blown eating disorder.
This is probably a dumb question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there? Well, and we're fortunate that I don't have experience with an eating disorder. I mean, I feel very lucky. Other than that pressure, I'm 46, and I don't remember a time when I thought I was at a good weight. I always wanted to be thinner, but at the same
General
time,
American woman,
right? Is there a time when you're, and this is also a weird word to use with type 1, is there a time when you're cured of an eating disorder, or is it something that you just carry with you and have to always deal with?
I would say it's something that, I would say both. It's something that you always carry with you, and type 1 diabetics do carry a higher relapse rate than non-diabetics. But I will say that as for me personally, there have been so many situations where I look back on it and I know the old me would have been so triggered and so likely to take that situation and turn it and spiral. And it's done nothing. I've been able to laugh at it. I've had horrible endocrinology appointments where all my new doctors wanted to do is talk about my weight and the fact that it is too high and my numbers and that they are too high. And afterwards I've been like, well, that was a horrible endocrinologist. And I went and I got myself some fish and chips with my mom, and then we went home, and that was it. And that was the day. And I can look back on that and know that, like, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, that would have been a very triggering event. But today I live in a recovered world where the idea of messing with my health for that reason doesn't even cross my mind anymore. Like, the idea of doing anything that would negatively impact my health, it doesn't even come up. When my blood sugar is unexpectedly high, I am irritated and I am bewildered, but I never have the inclination, just let it ride like I used to. So I will say that there does come a point where you do get to just be yourself again, where you're no longer you're not like a walking shell like you were in your eating disorder, and you're not a walking shell of recovery where everything you do is trying to just be in recovery and be recovered and work towards it. Because I don't work towards my recovery anymore. I just am recovered. And so I will say that although it's always there, it's not something I have to work for anymore.
Wow. That's a great message of hope too. And maybe I can ask you here the message to people listening who may be realizing that they need help.
Yeah. And I will say, Diabulimia Helpline, our moniker is DBH, which is not just an abbreviation for our name. It also stands for Dream, Believe, Hope, which is what we think is what the eating disorder steals from you and what we intend to give back to you. That ability to dream again, because your dreams are stolen from you when you have an eating disorder, because all you become about is that ideal of looking thin, or that ideal image you have of yourself. And the belief in yourself again, because we stop believing in our ability. We stop believing in our ability to achieve our dreams. We stop believing in our ability to do anything. And especially, I feel like as women, we start believing that we are just these walking shells of what we look like. And we stop believing in that innate ability we are given at birth to do extraordinary things. And then last, but certainly not least, and my personal favorite, is hope. Because I feel like that is what is drained of us when we are at our darkest, and when our eating disorder is at its most powerful, is when we feel hopeless. And so we are all about restoring your hope in life, your hope in yourself, your hope in your future. Because yes, we are all type 1 diabetics, and you're going to walk out of your eating disorder a type 1 diabetic. But thanks to amazing campaigns like the Live Beyond campaign, we see type 1 diabetics doing extraordinary things every day. And that could be you doing an extraordinary thing. All you have to do is take your life back from your eating disorder. And we really believe that. And we've seen it every day with our clients.
Erin, is there a cost? I mean, what happens when someone calls the hotline?
It's not. The hotline is completely free. In fact, all of our services to our clients, from our insurance referral services, our doctor services, to our clients, it's all 100% free. There is such a burden on patients to pay for treatment as it is. inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, doctor services is all so expensive as it is. We feel like that our part in this dance should cost you nothing, and that as our service is to find you the right referral services, the right doctor, the right step to your first step on recovery. And so our part in that is absolutely free for our clients. And we also have things like mentorship programs called the Diabuddy program, where we can pair you up with someone who's been in recovery if you feel like you want a more one-on-one relationship, which we found to be very helpful for so many of our members.
Wonderful. Erin, thank you so much for joining me. We will link up all the information, the phone number, the website, resources. I'm so glad you were able to spend some time and explain this and share your story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Much more information on the helpline at diabetes-connections.com, or just click on the show notes, however you're listening. That 24-hour hotline, again, 425-985-3635. If you need help, if you'd like to learn more, if you're trying to find ways to talk to your kiddo about this, because, I hadn't thought about talking to Benny about it because, as I mentioned, I was afraid that he hadn't heard about it yet. But, as she said, they go to camp, they hang out with other kids, they hear these things. I'm not shy about giving him the birds and the bees talks or other things like that. So, I'm going to have to put my big girl pants on and talk to him about it. Please just get the information. And boy, that's tough stuff. I give Erin a lot of credit there. It is time for our Know Better segment this week, and diabetes is on the rise. Somewhere it's been pretty rare, in China. Right? We'll get to that in just a second. Let me tell you about No Foods. No Foods is the leading provider of grain-free food products. No Foods helps health-conscious consumers achieve their diet and fitness goals by producing delicious, nutritionally superior, natural, grain, gluten-free, and low glycemic index alternatives to traditional grain-based foods. What does that mean? It means bread slices, waffles, wraps, donuts, cupcakes, croutons, pancake mix, and more without gluten, without dairy. It is yummy. Use the promo code STACEY10, STACEY 10, to save on your next order. Just go to diabetes-connections.com and look for the No Foods logo. I ran across an article in Medscape recently, and I'll link it up, of course, in the show notes. In China, 2/3 of new type 1 diabetes cases are in adults. This was the first population-based study of type 1 across all age groups in China. It has also showed a rapid increase since the mid-1990s in people under 15 years of age. Now, China has typically had a lower incidence of the disease than, in Europe or in America, but they found that 65% of new onset type 1 diabetes cases were in people over 20 years old. Now, China is not unique in that many of the people with type 1 who are adults were misdiagnosed with type 2 at first. And that's one of the reasons why they really are trying to get more publicity in China for this study. Of course, no real reason is given. They think possible reasons: change of environment, change in behaviors, but, quote, further study is needed to find out the actual reason. Pretty much everywhere further study is needed. Interestingly, though, a correlation was seen between type 1 diabetes and age, latitude, and exposure to sunlight. And that's not the first time this has happened. Other studies have shown, when they looked at people of European descent, other studies have shown that higher latitudes, both north and south, carry a higher risk. So, the further you get away from the equator, possibly related to lack of vitamin D. There are many exceptions to this rule, though. So, there are parts of the world in which type 1 diabetes has risen rapidly, in India and sub-Saharan Africa. So, you can't pin it on vitamin D, but it's really interesting. And just going back to China, to give you an idea of the scope of the study here, they used data from about 10% of the national population, which comes down to 133 million people. So this is not a small study by any means. Not a lot of answers, a lot of new information. Unfortunately, more cases of type 1 around the world and more researchers looking at why. And now you know better. Big thank you to so many of you who sent me private messages and posted in the Facebook group. Congratulations and Mazel Tov on Benny's Bar Mitzvah. I really appreciate that. And we're still walking on cloud 9. Again, the way the podcast is taped, this is just a couple of days after the celebration. So I just want to say a couple of quick things about it if I could. I mentioned the blood sugar craziness earlier in the show. One of the nicest things about a celebration like this is you are in a room with everybody who loves you, right? Everybody who could make it. My relatives were there, and my friends, Benny's friends, our different communities, and our diabetes friends were there. And I talked at the service about how lucky Benny is to have all this support and how it is now his job to make sure that as he needs help, he gives back and helps those in his community that need it as well. And we had a whole table of, I call our diabetes friends, but we had his endocrinologist was there, his CDE, the camp director, a camp counselor, another diabetes mom who works a lot with JDRF, who I'm very close to, and Benny's close to her son. These people have known him since he was 23 months old. And we've been really fortunate. He's had the same care people. They're our friends. Now that we've come to have such a close relationship with them, that we wanted them to be part of this celebration. And when I looked at that table, you go around, you talk to everybody, I was just beaming. And they, it was just such a moment of joy that we all met in this awful circumstance. I love them. I wish I didn't have to meet them. I wish diabetes wasn't in our lives. But I'm so glad to know them and to know that they truly care about my son. It was just a wonderful, wonderful feeling. And I'm so fortunate we were able to have that. So that was a big takeaway from the Bar Mitzvah. It really was incredible. Wow. And the camp director reminded me, camp registration is right around the corner. So I will be talking about that with you as well, because truly, if you want to send your child to diabetes summer camp, most of them open registration the beginning of February. We're having a big event here in the Charlotte area to make sure everybody is educated about the different kinds of camps. Please contact the American Diabetes Association in your area, JDRF, or whatever camps are in your area. They will start filling up fast. And for us, diabetes camp was a real game changer. It really was fantastic. I'm going to be speaking in Greensboro in the next couple of weeks in March. I'll also be at the JDRF chapter in Chesapeake Bay. Then I go down to Orlando in April. If you'd like me to speak at your event, please drop me a line, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. You can also join the Facebook group. It's growing fast. And I think that's really where a lot of the movement's going to be on Facebook now. So please, I'll still have the page always, but please check us out in the Facebook group, Diabetes Connections, the group. And that's really the best way to keep in touch with me and to meet other people who listen to the show as well. And don't forget, we have a contest every week with no foods on different platforms. So check us out on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all that good stuff. And the newsletter. Wow, I'm hitting all the pegs at the end of this show. But the newsletter goes out every week as well with great information, stuff I don't talk about during the show because some of it is just easier to read than to listen to, as I like to say. Big thanks to my editor, to John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Always appreciate his help. And big thanks to you as you listen. Love spending this hour every week with people who just get it, right? Oh, it's terrific. It is a privilege to do this. I'm Stacey Sims, and I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.